General, thank you so much for joining us here today for this really wonderful occasion to honor and recognize really a legendary public servant and lawyer in Washington State history, and that, of course, is Slade Gorton. First, big round of applause for Slade Gorton. So the senator and I just came from a wonderful lunch we had with students, members of the Moot Court Board upstairs. We had a great conversation, and we're looking forward to a conversation with all of you. I have some introductory comments to get us going, and I'll say a few words about Senator Gorton before we turn it over to John Hughes, his biographer, and Senator Gorton, who are going to have what will be a fascinating conversation. So first, a couple things. There will be different times for Q&A throughout the day, as you know. There is media here, I believe KUOW. I think it's going to be telecast on TVW. So we really appreciate the media taking time to join us here today. A big thank you to the University of Washington, to the law school, to help put this together. It's just been a huge, huge help. Craig Wright. Craig, where are you? Right over here. Craig, please stand up. Big round of applause for Craig and his whole team. So Craig, as some of you might know, before he got on board here at the University of Washington Law School, was the chief deputy for my predecessor, Rob McKenna. So he knows the AG's office very, very well. So thanks to you and your team. I know it's a team effort to put this together. It's been fantastic. And there's a big team on my end who've been involved in this. I'm just going to pick one person right now. That's Lindsay Oden, right up here. Lindsay, please stand up. Lindsay does a great job. And we have about more than 1,000 employees in the AG's office. Lindsay's the employee who does historical work for us. I'm intensely interested in the history of the AG's office, the individuals, the staff, the attorneys, the AGs themselves who have worked in our office since before statehood. And so Lindsay's job is to weave that history together, make it available to our office, but also to the public, because we can learn so much from our experience in the office, and we've had such huge implications and effects on the state of Washington. So Lindsay does a great job with that. Now, I have a few slides, and fair warning, Senator, I've got a few slides that will take you back in time a little bit as well, because just to set the stage, and I mentioned this upstairs, when you've served multiple terms as a U.S. Senator, after a while, I think it's natural for the people of your state to think of you as a U.S. Senator kind of first, second, and third. But as you all know, I suspect, the Senator had a long political career in the state legislature and, of course, as Attorney General before he became a U.S. Senator. And he had 12 years as Attorney General. And that's the focus of this symposium, is the focus on the 12 years that the Senator had as Attorney General here in the state of Washington. So I'm going to start here with the first slide. So the Senator has been just wonderful on the historical side. I've had a chance to sit down with him and do an interview with him that we've taped for folks in the office. And I actually read not too long ago, to sort of set the stage for a conversation about an Attorney General. I read a description of the job of Attorney General that was written not too long ago. And here's what it says. It says, the obligation of the Attorney General is to uphold the laws and the Constitution. That is absolute. The Attorney General takes on anybody, from the President of the United States to the most influential business person, politician, or special interest group that violates the law, even when his action will lose some support and campaign contributions, even if it jeopardizes his future in public service. Senator, I don't know if you recognize those words or not, but they are your words from a campaign mailing when he ran for Attorney General. That's his flyer. So I collect political memorabilia, as the Senator knows. I'm wearing his button from 1968 when he ran for Attorney General. Found this in an antique store down in Pioneer Square. The proprietor knows to pull aside all Washington State political memorabilia for me. And this is a description of the job, written back in, I think, the 60s or 70s. It's a perfect description of the job. And that's what we're going to be hearing a lot about the Senator, is his role as Attorney General on doing exactly what he laid out in his presentation. One of the great political buttons in Washington State history. I'm a Slade Gorton skinny cat. Senator Gorton has always been an independent thinker, I think it's fair to say. This button is when he ran for the U.S. Senate against Warren Magnuson. And when he campaigned as a skinny cat, which meant he did not accept political action committee donations. This is of my 9-year-old twins. I have a big political button collection, Senator. This is their favorite button right there, for sure. Let me take you back to 1968 and those 12 years, very briefly. That was a pivotal time in our office on many levels, in the AG's office. Just give you a couple examples. We doubled the number of attorneys and professional staff during his 3 terms in our office. It expanded significantly. entire divisions that are large divisions now, consequential divisions, were created when Senator Gorton was the Attorney General: ecology, social and health services. Significant increase in consumer protection. Here's just one headline from a newspaper back then: "New era, now let the consumer be aware." Senator Gorton really focused many of his efforts on consumer protection issues. He also had time to spend a lot of time with the staff. He's a beloved figure in our office. He's spoken to the office before at events. He's a beloved figure in his office. He is well remembered by many throughout our office for his professional demeanor at all times, and his great intellect and his caring personality as well. Here we are in my office. This is when we had a chance to do an interview. And I just want to say, as a public official, look, having role models is important in anything we do in life, right? And you're going to learn about a lot of decisions that Senator Gorton made as Attorney General that I find particularly inspiring. One of them was, we have a baseball team in Seattle. You might remember the Seattle Pilots, some of you. My dad went to opening day for the Seattle Pilots at old Sick's Stadium, right? Sick's Stadium, right? Sick's Stadium. They lasted 1 year before they left. We have a baseball team because Attorney General Slade Gorton sued Major League Baseball. And as a result of that lawsuit, the resolution was a team was going to come to Seattle. This is borrowed from Senator Gorton's scrapbook, which he loaned to me for our historical work. Though I think those are your tickets for opening night from 1979, if I remember correctly. The senator is a huge baseball fan, but we have Major League Baseball in Seattle for one reason, right? Attorney General Slade Gorton. How many Attorney Generals get a bobblehead? He's got one. That's the Slade Gorton bobblehead. That's the one that I have in my office, signed by Slade. So I think a few are still available if you want one. I think a few more are available as well. Now, he took that baseball interest not just to helping the people of the state of Washington by having a baseball team, but he and then Governor Dan Evans started an annual tradition of having a softball match. Attorney General versus Governor's office. The two offices would battle it out. And they were pretty heated battles. That's from a newspaper. I will focus you on the headline: AG's stomp Mudcats. That's the governor, 21-11. The form of Attorney General Gorton is impressive there. Just for comparison points. You? Not bad, right? So we continued the tradition. There was a lapse, probably because the governor never won a match against your team, Senator. And so we brought back the tradition just this last year, and proud to report that the AG's office had a convincing win. The first pitch was thrown out by Senator Slade Gorton, which seemed entirely appropriate. We had a great time. So lastly, just a couple, and I'll be very brief, you're going to hear about these more, but when I mentioned important decisions that the senator made that I find, especially admirable. One is John Goldmark was a state legislator who served with the senator in the state legislature. John Goldmark, a Democrat. He was accused of being a communist back during the Red Scare by newspaper publishers at that time, and he lost his reelection. There was a lawsuit. John Goldmark decided to sue for libel, and Senator Gorton was asked to be a character witness for John Goldmark in that trial in Eastern Washington. It would have been easy to have said, I'm really busy that week. Right? He had a lot of political pressure. I've talked to him about this. I've read about it. He had a lot of political pressure not to go do that. It would have been easy to say no. He went and did it. Was a character witness for John Goldmark at that time in our state's history. To his great credit. He was rewarded with a primary opponent, if I remember correctly, in his next election. He's nodding his head. There were consequences to that, but he was prepared to face those to do what he said, what he felt was the right thing, and history has certainly proven that to be the case. He argued 14 Supreme Court cases before the United States Supreme Court. Chief Justice Warren Burger said, quote, "Slade Gorton makes the best arguments for the Supreme Court of any Attorney General in America." You don't have to limit to AGs. Another Supreme Court Justice, Justice White, I think it was, Senator Gorton, who instructed the law clerks one day to go watch the oral argument because Senator Gorton, then Attorney General Gorton, was presenting an oral argument. And they said, if you want to see how it's done, go to this oral argument. He was at that level before the U.S. Supreme Court as an attorney. And I think this is my last example. He was the first prominent Washingtonian to call on Richard Nixon to resign. I've read a lot about this. Take my word for it. The Pierce County Republican Party, what did they do? They expelled you? Yes. They expelled him. Pierce County Republican Party expelled him for that. It was an intensely unpopular decision in his own party. He didn't have to do it. Again, there's nothing in your job description as Attorney General that says you need to give a speech to the Bellevue Rotary and say you're calling on the president to resign when no one else around the country is really doing that, who's an elected official, who's a Republican. He did it, and as history's turned out, it was the right decision. So just to conclude, I have a lot of admiration for Senator Gorton. He and I are of different political parties, as you know. I suspect he does not agree with every decision I make. That doesn't mean I agree with every decision he makes either, but I have so much respect for his service, especially as Attorney General, right? Especially in that role, where over and over, from my perspective, he made tough decisions that he did not have to make, right? He was bold when it was time to be bold. Sue Major League Baseball. I can only imagine that's a big decision, taking that on and winning. And it's that example that I think really merits honoring him on his 90th birthday, of course, this month, and also 50th anniversary as Attorney General. So we're now going to be joined with Senator Gorton and his biographer, John Hughes. And as they come forward, I'm just going to briefly introduce John Hughes to you, although I think he needs little introduction. But John first had a celebrated 42-year career in journalism. He's an award-winning writer, photographer, and columnist. He retired in 2008 as the editor and publisher of the Daily World in Aberdeen. And then he became what I think is his finest role, I hope he doesn't mind me saying this, as chief historian for the Secretary of State's office. So he's written many, many books about Washington state history, biographies of former governors like Booth Gardner and John Spellman, civil rights pioneer Lillian Walker, among others, and what is arguably his finest work so far is his biography of Slade Gorton. So there's no better person to kick us off with an interview with Senator Slade Gorton than John Hughes. Please give a round of applause to the Senator. Thank
you. Great to see you, Senator. Well, Bob, I've been a political button collector for 50 years, and when I first met Bob and found out about his interest in the hobby, he proceeded to work all of the sources that I tried to cultivate and has fleeced me roundly for the past 2 years in collecting buttons. So, and you just stole some of my thunder here, but I'm going to amplify some of these things that I had the privilege of getting to talk to Slade about in hour after hour of fascinating oral history interviews. I think we need to go back to John Goldmark, Slade, because you told me that was a pivotal moment in your career in politics. To amplify about John Goldmark, a brilliant Renaissance man who ended up being represented by another brilliant Renaissance man, Bill Dwyer. And the setting in 1963 for that libel trial that ended in a historic United States Supreme Court decision was the old Okanagan County Courthouse. And you told me that you thought when you walked in there that it was like a scene from To Kill a Mockingbird. It had all that ambiance. Goldmark graduated from Harvard Law School, came west with his wife Sally and 2 young sons to operate a ranch in the Okanagan. After running for the legislature in 1956, 2 years before you, in the Dan Evans, that first term freshman together, it was learned by the John Birch Society and a right-wing journalist named Ashley Holden, who published the Tonasket Tribune, that John's wife Sally, as an idealistic young New Dealer during the Depression, had briefly been a member of the Communist Party. And after that, the Birch Society and all the right-wingers in Eastern Washington were in full cry. Slade told me that there was no one that you loved to debate more than John Goldmark. Why was that, Slade? What was there about him?
John Goldmark, I think, was the smartest member of the State House of Representatives when I got there. He represented Okanagan County, as you said, though he really had a much more Seattle-like or even New York-like attitude toward political issues. And he was extremely eloquent, and he knew what he stood for. And I loved debating him, because I figured if I broke even in a debate against John Goldmark, I was doing really quite well. So we were friendly opponents, not close personal friends in the legislature. But what happened to him in the 1962 election in Okanagan County shouldn't happen to anyone. It was a mean and nasty campaign. And you mentioned he got the man I considered to be the best lawyer in Seattle, Bill Dwyer, to represent him in a libel trial. The same Bill Dwyer whom I later hired as Attorney General to represent the state of Washington in
Exactly.
suing the American League and
Exactly.
creating the Seattle Mariners.
Some of that rhetoric that they used against the Goldmarks, here, one handbill said that the Goldmarks were, quote, under Communist Party discipline and tools of a monstrous conspiracy to remake America into a totalitarian state. And that was, I think there was a hammer and a sickle on some of those handbills as well.
I think there was. I think there was. And Bill Dwyer was a good enough attorney to go into the Okanagan County Courthouse and persuade 12 jurors that Goldmark had been wronged, and came up with what sounds like a modest judgment now at $40,000. You'd have to multiply that by 10 or 20
More probably.
to be in today's dollars. And it was ultimately reversed because that trial took place before a case called the New York Times case, which essentially ruled that political figures can't be libeled, that the burden of proof is just too high. But that didn't matter to John Goldmark, and it didn't matter much to Bill Dwyer either, because he'd been vindicated. And he'd been vindicated by people who were his own contemporaries and lived in his own community. So ultimately, justice was done.
That classic case, Times v. Sullivan, as we all learned in journalism school, was the actual malice, was the benchmark for that. So when Bill Dwyer came to you and asked if you would be a character witness, tell everyone what went through your mind.
I think technically it was a reputation witness rather than a character witness, which is about all you could do. It was a very narrow focus on which your testimony had to take place. I knew the minute that Bill called me, I knew him fairly well at the time, but I had two choices. I could say yes and get myself into big trouble in the next election, or say no and look on myself as a coward for the rest of my life. So in that sense, it wasn't a terribly difficult decision. It was a decision I wished that I hadn't had to make at all. But when it came, that simply was going to be the way it was going to be. As it turned out, I probably played a larger role in the case than that narrow reputation witness, because the other side saw fit to cross-examine me. And they went into other matters so that I could talk about my personal relationships with him, as we have here, and my general respect for him, rather than just his abstract reputation overall. So in for a dime, in for a dollar, it was worthwhile. But since I was then still a newcomer in the state of Washington, it was literally the first time I ever set foot in Okanagan County.
And the fallout from that was sort of a happy, that you began to be more than just a sort of a backbench young Republican.
I did have a major political, primary election political challenge the next time, which I surmounted very well, and it put me up a step as far as members of the legislature were concerned.
When you and I first talked, we found out that we were both admirers of what Polonius said in Hamlet, "This above all to thine own self be true." It was a real moment, a moment, as you said, where you could either stand up for what you wanted to believe, what you believed, or be a coward. It's pretty amazing. It truly is. Tell us what happened to John Goldmark after that. What was his career just over?
His political career was certainly over. And shortly after that, he moved with one of his sons to Seattle and practiced law. And as you remember, his son was shot dead at his own doorstep on, I think, Christmas Eve a few years later by someone who thought he was shooting a communist.
Incredible, incredible. Well, let's fast forward to 1969. You're Washington's newly minted Attorney General, and you picked Don Brazier, with wide-ranging experience in politics and as a prosecutor and politician, to be your chief deputy. And you picked 31-year-old Christopher Bailey as your recent Harvard graduate to head the Consumer Protection and Antitrust Division. But your first job there was to carefully evaluate the people on staff who had worked for John J. O'Connell, who'd just been defeated in a bid for governor by Dan Evans. Tell us about that. Bob Dornan told me yesterday, reminded me that, that you claim to be the godfather to Bob's son. How did that work?
Bob Dornan was the #1 Assistant Attorney General to John O'Connell. And I had had a couple of cases with him on the other side of the aisle in the state Supreme Court. I liked him even then, and so I asked him to arrange an opportunity for me to meet individually with each of the approximately 100 Assistant Attorneys General then to determine whether or not to keep them. The Attorney General may very well have more people who serve at his pleasure than the governor does in this state, because the formal legal staff all serve at the pleasure of the Attorney General himself, and I wanted to make individual decisions, which I did. We got to the end of it shortly before Christmas. You didn't mention this, that first Attorney General's race was so close, I didn't know I was going to be Attorney General until early December. And Bob Dornan had not really put himself on the list for such an interview. And so I said at the end of the time, now what about you, Bob? Do you want to stay? And he sort of stuttered around and mixed up and said, well, he'd been sort of out, looking for another position and so on. And
he figured you'd want to hire your own person.
He figured that I'd want to hire my own person. And I said, no, I'm going to organize the office a little bit differently, but I really like you and I'd love to have you stay. Okay. And his wife had a baby 9 months the day thereafter.
Bob adds that when he went on the Thurston County Superior Court bench, thanks to you and Dan Evans, that he had a son or a daughter 9 months later, so he figures that Governor Evans really ought to claim to be the godfather there. But I thought that Dornan told me when I was working on the biography this that I thought was really telling. The key thing was that Slade was a lawyer's lawyer. The fact that his first priority was to really get to know people tells you a lot about him. I don't think he ever asked anyone if they were a Republican or a Democrat. He just wanted talented people. That's all that mattered. And others told me the same thing. Ed Mackey, Phil Austin, Charlie Rowe. You really had a remarkable staff. And I think O'Connell, to his credit, had nurtured a really good group of people, hadn't he?
He had. Yeah. He had. And I think there was only one of those 100 that I thought wouldn't fit in the office. It was a very small number.
I think we ought to put Bill Dwyer back at center stage. And as Bob alluded, many of you know that Slade loves baseball like a kid growing up going to Wrigley Field. I think that when the Cubs finally won the World Series, the two happiest people on earth were Bill Murray and Slade Gorton. What were you doing when the Cubs won the series? Were you there for the?
No, I wasn't there, but I was sure following it.
Did you stand up and cheer or pop your hand through a straw hat or do anything classic like that?
Nothing classic, except say, what one has to say, if you're a lifelong fan of the Chicago Cubs and the Seattle Mariners and have not learned patience, nothing else in life will ever teach that lesson to you.
Well, we can cut to the chase. What's it going to take for the Seattle Mariners at long last to come back into their own and really be contenders?
Well, we've been devastated.
And you've got a seat in the owner's box, by the way. Thanks to Slade saving baseball for Seattle not once but twice, you've got pretty good seats.
The prospects for the Mariners suffered a terrible blow a month or so ago when that Japanese superstar signed with on us, because we all really expected that Seattle was going to be his goal.
Seemed like a natural.
So we just have to hope that John Stanton and his new team are really geniuses this winter in the new people that they pick up, and that everything falls into place next summer. But in January, every team's a pennant winner.
Absolutely. You told me an interesting thing about what it took for a town to be a Major League Baseball town and be really to be inculcated with the flavor of baseball. And what did you say it took? Like 3 generations?
No, I said 25 years.
25 years.
When parents who had gone to the ballpark when they were young were taking their kids to the ballpark. So you were building a generational bridge. Many expansion teams, the pilots were not alone in that respect, have come a cropper because they couldn't get through even the first 10 years, maybe, of being a major league team.
Pilots. Boy, I remember the pilots at the old Six Stadium.
They were the most dysfunctional of
Yeah,
all
they
of
were.
them.
In fact, Ball 4, the immortal biography of Jim Bouton, talks about the pilots and what a ragtag outfit it was. But they were fun. Let's flash forward to Dan Evans, Governor Evans, King County Executive John Spellman, Seattle Mayor Wes Ullman, I think Eddie Carlson, and Slade Gorton flew to Oakland to meet with Major League Baseball's owners group. What happened there? What did they tell you about? Well, you were trying to make certain that the pilots, or at least a franchise, stayed in Seattle.
Eddie Carlson and downtown Seattle business had come up with what, to be perfectly honest, was a gimmick to keep the pilots in Seattle, which Major League Baseball rejected out of hand. But in rejecting it, they told us, nonetheless, we're going to see to it that the pilots stay in Seattle. We got on the plane and went home, and I'm speaking figuratively, but only slightly figuratively. They were gone the next day.
Yeah. Lock, stock, and barrel.
Lock, stock, and barrel. And you've illustrated one of the great public services that Bill Dwyer did for just for rightness in the state. The other one was my genius in saving the Mariners was to hire Bill Dwyer.
Absolutely.
For that matter.
I think, by the way, and I knew him well, I thought he was the best trial lawyer that I had ever seen. And I covered the Bolt decision. I saw a lot of good lawyering.
I agree. I think he was, and let me put it this way. When I was a young attorney, and even in the first couple of years that I was Attorney General, I always thought that if I got in really big trouble and were wrong, I'd want John Ehrlichman as my lawyer. But that if I were right, I would want Bill Dwyer.
And John Dean was somewhere in the middle there. Yeah. Well, so the strategy, you had the prescience to hire, and good sense to hire Bill Dwyer to take on Major League Baseball. And tell us about the strategy that you developed. I think it's really interesting.
I have to say the strategy was developed by Bill with my agreement. As some of the lawyers and law students here know, back in the 1920s, baseball was declared essentially not to be a business, and therefore not subject to federal antitrust laws. An obvious violation of those laws if they were applicable to Major League Baseball, but they were exempt from it. So you couldn't bring a standard lawsuit for equitable relief to say they violated the antitrust laws and therefore they had to give us a team back. That was simply not available. So Bill's tactics or strategy was not to go into the federal court at all, but to go into the state court, into the Superior Court in King County, and sue for damages. Not a suit to require Major League Baseball to come back to Seattle, because that's a suit in equity and no juries are involved in it. And Bill wanted, quite properly, to get the American League in front of a local jury. And the only way to do that was to sue for damages. The fact the Kingdome was under construction and would have no tenant when it was finished, and the loss of taxes to the state, et cetera, et cetera. So the lawsuit itself did not demand that Seattle get another team. It only demanded a number of millions of dollars in damages. But Bill's view of the subject was that Major League Baseball would get such a black eye by losing a big verdict that it would be forced as an alternate to offer us a team. And he was exactly 100% right in that respect. The case was just ready to go to the jury when Major League Baseball, that had been moved to Snohomish County,
yeah.
to Everett, on the ground that every potential juror in Seattle as a taxpayer had a financial interest because they were being taxed to build the Kingdome. So almost the day before our verdict was going to come down, the American League agreed to create the Mariners. Now it took 5 years to get the case to court.
1976, yes.
Because the American League did every procedural move to try to get it into federal court, to get it out of the state of Washington, and so on. And all they succeeded in doing was getting it moved from Seattle to Everett. But that Everett jury, in my view, this is my description, the Everett jury was going to vote capital punishment.
And we had what amounted to a friendly witness, and I happened to talk to Bill about this. Charlie O. Finley, the owner of the Oakland A's, was heaven sent for the prosecution in this case, because when he got on the stand, he was so arrogant that he talked down, he dodged, he bobbed, he weaved, he talked down to the jury, and he talked about strategies that Major League Baseball really wanted to keep secret. And at the end of one session, Dwyer told me that Finley sauntered past him and under his breath said, "You did your homework, didn't you, pal?" And also Jerry McNall, who was Dwyer's co-counsel, told me earlier that when they were in Chicago to take depositions, that Finley asked them what they were going to do afterwards and offered to line them up with a couple of hookers. And that was classic Charlie O. They of course declined. You said to me, Bill Dwyer just shredded the American League owners. We were about 20 days into trial when the American League lawyers realized the jury was going to vote for capital punishment and surrendered. I loved it. I loved it.
And one minor frustration, just a very minor frustration in it, was that the numbers that were involved in baseball then were so much smaller. They not only agreed to create the pilots, the Mariners, but they agreed that the franchise fee paid to the league for it would be the same as it had been 10 years earlier for the pilots.
Wow.
And that fee was $5,200,000. Now today, baseball franchises are going for over $1 billion.
Exactly.
If you can imagine it. But the state, representing the state of Washington, we never got our hands on any of the money. We actually got no damages for the state, but we got exactly what we wanted to begin with.
Ball team. Bob showed on the screen earlier that landmark headline from March 21st, 1974, Gorton and Nixon quit. And your daughter, Becky, told me that until she saw that headline over her morning Post Toasties or whatever, she never really realized how influential or what it meant to have a father involved in politics at that level. She was in 7th grade at the time. She said it was absolutely staggering to me. Tell us, Bob talked about this earlier, but tell us what led to that decision, because that was a very, very controversial thing. And as you noted, the Pierce County Republicans were not amused by that decision.
After the end of all of it, they asked me what I knew that they didn't know.
Huh.
They were very penitent.
Well, there was a line that you had in the speech that you gave to, I think, the Seattle Rotary Club.
Seattle Rotary,
yeah. And the one that really, the minute I read it, it struck me as so eloquent that you said, besides soliciting illegal campaign contributions, using the IRS to harass his enemies, withholding evidence from the Department of Justice and the U.S. Congress, he countenanced the 2-time selection as vice president of a man who turned out to be a common extortionist. And Agnew, being a newspaper man and one of the nattering nabobs, I guess, it struck me that Agnew was a pluperfect hypocrite and a criminal to boot. But tell us what led up to that. Was the bicycle trip across the country in the summer before that?
John, you got it right. Okay. The summer before that 1974 speech was the summer after I had been reelected Attorney General. And I had decided, and Sally had agreed, that we would bicycle from Olympia to Gloucester, Massachusetts to see my family that summer, go across the country. But we were inspired to do that by a woman middle school teacher in Mercer Island, who for 3 or 4 straight years took a dozen or so of her roughly 8th grade students across the country by bicycles. And in the 1972 summer, when I was campaigning for re-election, we had met them over near Wenatchee when they were just getting started. And I was absolutely fascinated with what they were doing. And when Sally and I got in our car to drive back across the mountains, I said, wouldn't it be a lot more fun to be doing that this summer than what we're doing? Yes, dear.
Yeah. She told me she lost 3 dress sizes on that trip. That was the best thing.
She did. So that was the inspiration for doing it. But what it did do, remember this was before cell phones or internet or anything else. I had general delivery drop points. The office would send me things I had to sign and so on, and a stamped envelope to send them back, and anything else I needed to know. But there was plenty of time to think on that trip, and it was Watergate summer. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought that that the case against Nixon was irrefutable. And so in the speech, even though that was the next winter, I believe that I only made statements that were not disputed. Much was still going on in that dispute at the time, and just saying, if we just accept what everyone knows and agrees to, he's forfeited his right to be president. Whether I would have gone through that long thought process had I been doing office things every day, rather than going across the whole United States and giving my children an adventure they didn't want, was still one of the greatest things they'd ever have in their lives. I'm not at all sure, but there was plenty of time to think away from newspapers, away from television, and just what was the future of the country going to be like.
You told me that in that speech of the Rotary Club, you quoted Washington, Madison, Hamilton, and Shakespeare, saying that Nixon had burdened the federal government with a moral climate of cynicism and suspicion.
Strong letter follows.
Yeah, stronger letter follows. Do you see some really worrisome parallels to what we're enduring now?
Yes, of course there are. There, if not, yeah, I guess that's right. They're parallels. They don't necessarily intersect.
No.
They're different fact situations, but there are some very real reflections of Nixon's problems and the problems of the present president.
People ask me my politics all the time because I now work for a Republican office holder, Kim Wyman, who runs a very, very bipartisan shop, with the anchor being our elections division, in picking up on what she's done, what had been done before with Bruce Chapman, Ralph Monroe, Sam Reed. It's really a terrific place to work. But I always say that I'm either a Dan Evans Republican or a Scoop Jackson Democrat. What I worry about today is I see things so polarized, right and left, that there's precious room in the center for moderation and common sense and civility, entertaining the notion that the other person might actually have an opinion. And for all those hours that we talked, what I learned after covering you as a politician and then becoming your biographer and friend, that these things trouble you. And talk to us about that, about where we are today.
Well, my view last year, no, it's year before last now, during the 26 campaign, was that both of our 2 major parties failed the American people. That the Republicans moved well to the right, and the Democrats basically through the Sanders candidacy and what that did to Hillary Clinton moved well to the left, and neither of them was speaking to the great majority of the American people. And that was reflected in polls. The very large number of people who didn't like who didn't like either candidate at all. And I think we're in a tough situation today. Those divisions are great. I may just say, incidentally, here at a university, I spent most of my life listening or reading political scientists who criticized the 2 major parties because there wasn't any difference between them and because there was too much overlap. Parties ought to have a single ideological point of view, and now they've got it, and they don't like it very much, and none of us do. But I don't think, just as that was not a permanent division, neither is the present one. And the success in politics 8, 10, 20 years from now is going to go to the party which broadens its base into that center that was abandoned 2 years ago.
The danger right now for my daughters and a lot of young people I talk to is that the cacophony from the White House and the vulgarisms and all that, and the whole nature of politics, it's almost like people are just closing their ears. And given the fact of social media, the Twitter sphere and all that, we're doing a project now comparing or looking back at 1968, 50 years later, and having been a reporter then, a young reporter, I saw people in the streets, pro, con, civil rights, women's rights, Vietnam, support our troops, bring them home, and all that. And I just don't, absent some of the early protests, I just don't see as much energy and involvement. Is it troubling to you?
That's an interesting observation. Because it seems to me there's been quite a lot of energy involved in both sides of this dispute, but the energy has come from the two extremes.
Exactly.
And doesn't involve the people in the middle who are either becoming cynical or apathetic.
That's exactly what I wanted to say.
Which is the problem. I may say, while we're here, you talked about running the Aberdeen Daily World. The Aberdeen Daily World editorial board was the most fun that I had when I would go around the state, because you and your people were interested in talking about issues, not in gotchas. And I would always leave the Aberdeen Daily World and say, it's too bad that that isn't a real newspaper in a place where 100,000 people are going to read it.
Well, it's 20,000 at one time. Let's talk about those 14 quills on the office wall. By tradition, every morning at the United States Supreme Court, when it's in session, the clerks lay out on the desks old-fashioned quill pens on the attorneys' tables. And each one of those 14 quills that I squinted at.
And inkwells.
And inkwells.
You could actually dip those quills into an inkwell and write with them.
I
never saw anyone do that, but you could.
I'm so old that in 1953 at A.J. West School in Aberdeen, I put a girl's braids in an inkwell. And but half of those cases involved Indian issues, including, of course, the Bolt decision, as well as the pitch debate over taxing cigarette sales at reservation smoke shops. But I think a panel to follow is going to really get into those cases. Tell us on the Bolt decision, by the way, those of you who are attorneys, and that's most of this room, will really be amused by the fact that when I wrote the chapter about Slade's arguments before the United States Supreme Court, and he said that he didn't become Attorney General of the state of Washington not to argue those cases himself because it would be so much fun, that I absolutely immersed myself in those cases and spent countless hours at the law library. And when I'd finished distilling those 14 cases into 5,000 words, I sent it to Slade, and I anxiously waited for his review, and I got an email that said, "Good summary." And I found out later that that's high praise. But you told me that I went home and I told Patsy, and she said, "How's it, my wife, how's it going?" And I said, "If I could take the LSAT right now, I'm in," because I knew I was. You tell us about the biggest mistake in the practice of law I've made in my life, you told me. It concerns something that was really obscure to me, but you explained to me, and I found it just tantalizing, a slip opinion on the Bolt decision.
Yes, the Bolt decision was, of course, a major decision, and it affects our lives today. And it had to do first basically with the meaning of the Indian treaties in 1853.
Yep.
Whether or not the right to fish in common with the citizens of the territory meant having exactly the same rights as citizens, or whether it divided the fisheries 50-50. The Bolt decision, and the main part of the Bolt decision as affirmed by the Supreme Court of the United States, said the former. Ironically, from our point of view, as the appellants in the case, the last line in the Bolt decision was reversed and remanded but that was on two minor issues that only very, very slightly affect the overall impact of the decision itself. But there was the slip opinions are what comes out the day of the decision comes out before the volumes are printed, and it becomes a permanent part of the nation's judicial decisions. The slip opinion had a footnote, and the footnote basically said the case area involved in this case is 40% of the waters of the state of Washington, which would have meant an even division would be the Indians would get 20% of the fish in the state.
Talk about an error.
Yeah. It was a clear error on the part of whoever wrote the slip opinion. And the debate in the office was, this is so bad, do we petition for reconsideration? And so that the actual arithmetic division that they called for in that, or implied in that footnote, is the actual division itself. Or do we let it stand until it's absolutely permanent and then use it in some future case? And the worst decision I ever made was to petition for reconsideration, because the Supreme Court reconsidered it all right. They struck the footnote. Yeah.
The footnote was gone.
The
and
footnote
the
was
telltale
gone.
footnote, it's right out of Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah.
There it is. Fascinating. There's, I wanted to say something really important today, and there's a thoroughly erroneous notion that I still hear, that because Slade Gorton was involved in these pitched battles with Native Americans, that he's anti-Indian, or in any way a racist. I covered the Bolt decision for the Daily World at Aberdeen, which was ground zero for a lot that was happening, and I knew a lot of the Native American leaders of that era, including Billy Frank Jr. and Joe Delacruz. But I asked Ron Allen, who a former president of the National Congress of American Indians, about Slade for the introduction of the book. And this is what he said: "He was our toughest opponent. He made us better, smarter, and savvier. I certainly don't think Slade hates Indians. He just has strong opinions based on his review of what he considers the facts. He's always been a great lawyer, an insatiable reader with an incredible intellect. He can debate anything, constitutional law or scripture for that matter. He cared about the salmon and the environment, and he said the tribe should play a role. But when it came to sovereignty issues, we collided time and again. But that doesn't mean his heart wasn't in the right place." And I thought that was really important to include in the book. I ran into someone at the State Library just last week who thought that you were fundamentally anti-Indian. And the issue wasn't anti-Indian at all, was it?
No, not from a point of view of race or ethnicity.
It's about equal rights, as you saw it.
It's about equal rights.
Tell us about how you prepared for the daunting experience of having 9 of the smartest people on earth parse your ever utterance when you're standing up there with your quill. What did you do?
Every time we had certiorari granted and had an argument scheduled, I would go back to Washington, D.C. a good 3 days, maybe even 4 days before the argument was to take place, and would take 2 to 4 of my assistant or deputy attorneys general with me, ones who knew something about the case itself. And I have a tactile memory, so I would write out an argument, sometimes in full, or at least all of the points that I wanted to make on a long yellow legal pad, and then have the assistants in to present it, and present it as if I were the oral argument and they were the court, and encourage them, as a matter of fact, demanded of them that they interrupt me, that they ask questions, that they come up with the toughest questions that they possibly could, and I'd answer them as well as I could, and was never satisfied with my answers the first time around. Shoo them out of the room, rewrite the argument, do the same thing again, do the same response again, write it a third or fourth time. Basically, by the time I had written my argument with all of the necessary changes in it 4 or 5 times, I hardly needed to look at it to be able to get through it. And presenting the case as I wanted it to be presented. And incidentally, one reason that I ended up thinking that I could do a much better job at this than one of the people who had been with the case for 4 or 5 or 6 years was that I was looking at the case much more like that Supreme Court justice was looking at it, who had maybe read it the week before and the like, and could get closer into their minds and what they were thinking and what they were asking. And so the best of all of my arguments, and I don't even remember which of those cases it was, but it was toward the end, maybe the 10th or 11th of them, every question I got asked by a Supreme Court justice was the next point in the outline.
Wow.
And I felt quite good about that one. I never felt in any of the 14 that I had said all I needed to say or all I wanted to say. There was always something that gnawed at me. That, no, why didn't you do such and such or say thus and such? But you got to know the varying personalities of the members of the court quite well.
Did you ever spend any time with William O. Douglas?
No.
He was he on the court in 1970?
Oh, yes.
No, of course he was.
As a matter of fact, he was the subject of the worst start anyone ever had in arguing in front of the Supreme Court, which was namely me.
Tell us all about it.
The first case I argued was an Indian case, not fish, but the demand of the state of Washington that Indian smoke shops charge the tobacco tax, the big tobacco tax, and sales from those Indian smoke shops to non-Indians. And the Indians, of course, the smoke shops were making a lot of money because they could sell tobacco products way cheaper than anyone else could. It arose out of the Yakima Reservation. So I, thinking that here are this bunch of Eastern Harvard and Yale lawyers on the court whose idea of an Indian reservation comes from a John Wayne movie, I start out by saying, Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court, the Yakima Indian Reservation extends from the Cascade Mountains to the thread of the Yakima River. 80% of its population is non-Indian, and in fact, it includes 2 incorporated cities, Toppenish and Wapato. Justice Douglas leaned over the bench and said, no, it doesn't. He came from Yakima.
Of course, yeah. He knew every square mile.
He came from Yakima. He's 100% wrong, I'm 100% right, and who the hell are they going to believe? As it turned out, the case got sent back to the state Supreme Court on an undecided issue. And the issue itself was the 14th of my arguments. After Justice Douglas had retired, I won it.
Well, I'd like to turn now to the 9/11 Commission, where you developed strong mutual admiration relationships with Jamie Gorelick and Bob Kerrey, 2 centrist Democrats, and Phil Shannon's revealing book about the 9/11 Commission documents your defense of Jamie Gorelick against some really spurious accusations by then Attorney General John Ashcroft. I was really fascinated to learn that you and Bob Kerrey, Nebraska's former governor and U.S. Senator, developed the chapter on the nature of the enemy in the book. And I find it still really a riveting, one of the most riveting parts of the 9/11 Commission report. You wrote, because the Muslim world has fallen behind the West politically, economically, and militarily for the past 3 centuries, and because few tolerant or secular Muslim democracies provide alternative models for the future, Osama bin Laden's message finds receptive ears. It has attracted active support from thousands of disaffected young Muslims. The resentment of America and the West is deep. Tolerance, the rule of law, political and economic openness, the extension of greater opportunities to women, these cures must come from within Muslim societies themselves. The U.S. must support such developments, but this process is likely to be measured in decades, not years. Islam is not the enemy. It's not synonymous with terror, nor does Islam teach terror. America and its friends oppose a perversion of Islam, not the great world faith itself. And then you concluded, we can contribute to the struggle, but it has to be won internally, and the Muslim world's decline will never be reversed or even arrested as long as so much of Islam discriminates against 50% of its population that is female, education is a huge part of that war against terrorism. So are we making progress in this struggle? And I heard this morning on NPR that in Saudi Arabia, women for the first time are going to be allowed to attend soccer matches, albeit in a separate family section.
Isn't that a great step forward?
Huh? I don't know.
Go to a soccer game?
How are we safer today than we were?
We are safer today than we were. We're not perfectly safe, of course, as is evidenced by what goes on around. We have a stronger carapace against domestic terrorism here in the United States than we did before 9/11. But that's an entirely defensive mechanism. Through all of the more than 10 years since that report was written, far more Muslims have been killed by Muslim terrorists than non-Muslims, Americans or Europeans or anywhere else. A huge disproportion. But the fundamental conclusion that, as John Kerry and I wrote it and got every member of the 9/11 Commission to sign on, was that this particular battle is largely an internal battle. It will be over when the Muslim world itself decides that it doesn't want it going on anymore, to a broader extent than is the case today. Is there some progress in that direction? I think there is. It may depend. It depends on which country you're looking at, but that's not one that that's not an internal battle we can decide. And when U.S. presidents say thus and such is not true Islam, well, now who's going to pay any attention to a nominally Presbyterian United States president telling Muslims what true Islam requires?
Nominally. That's a great word. So if you follow the 9/11 Commission report and the hearings, as I did, the thing that really stood out was the dysfunction in the lack of communications but in the intelligence community. And in the follow-ups, I attended one, I think 5 years ago, that we had here on this campus. Are we breaking down some of those barriers so that the FBI, the CIA, the other members are really...
That may be the greatest success that we've had and that the Commission had, the creation of a Director of National Intelligence who has the right to get all intelligence reports from all, I think, 17 different federal intelligence agencies and to distribute them as that office sees fit is a major step forward and I think a major contribution to the fact that we have been much more successful since 9/11 than we were before 9/11. But some of the things that we required are in the papers now. For example, a system that determines when immigrants or visitors to the United States have left. You know, you get a tourist visa or you get a visa for a limited period of time, but we've had almost no way of telling whether or not people have overstayed their visas. That may be one of the things that's being discussed as we sit here today in connection with what happens before, what's the date, the 19th, that all the appropriations run out again and we're faced with a government shutdown. And beginning to deal with immigration may be a part of that. I hope that it is.
At the end of our last oral history interview 7 years ago, you said something that really rang with me. Do you remember what it was?
No.
You said, you know, I've had an absolutely marvelous life. And now from the vantage point of 90, now you're really a sage. Once you get to be 90, you're really installed.
You can't claim your middle age anymore.
What do you regard as your proudest achievements?
You know, there are objective things that take place in the internal ones. In many respects, I look more and more as I go by on the legacy I have left in people who are younger than I am. And the young people who became Assistant Attorney General while I held that job for 12 years. The staff people who are even younger than junior attorneys because most of them are just out of college, who were on my staff in the United States Senate. And giving them a sense of how government should actually operate and that they can contribute to it They are, many of them are here in the state of Washington. Some have stayed in Washington, D.C. Others are scattered all the way across the country. But that legacy is the single element of which I'm most proud.
Any regrets?
Yeah, I regret I didn't win every one of those Supreme
Yeah,
Court
absolutely,
cases.
absolutely.
I regret that the Mariners haven't won the pennant.
Yeah. Advice for the Attorney General and his remarkable team of bright folks there?
Bob has just as good a bunch of bright young people as I had, and he has every bit as much enthusiasm about the office as I had, and I'm very pleased that he keeps me advised of what's going on.
Have you ever played chess with Bob?
No, and
I
don't
understand that
intend
that's
to.
not something to do.
No, I'm not going to try that one.
Will Donald J. Trump be re-elected President of the United States?
No.
Look, 5 minutes remaining. All kidding aside, of all the things that I've done in a 50-year career as a journalist and historian, getting to share that time with Slade and write this book is really pretty remarkable. So if you get a chance to buy the book, or if you read the book and you want Slade to autograph it, we've got some for sale outside. Slade and I have agreed now that among the topics that we won't take questions on are Norwegian immigration, but everything else is fair game. Yes, ma'am.
I would just like to make more of an observation. Hi, Slade. I go back
Hi,
to
Pat.
Slade's Senate staff, and he can see me and he remembers me, and I'm just amazed. You are, I'm so much enjoying listening to this. But is Slade's really pioneering work in hiring women and hiring and promoting professional women. And I think he was smart because he knew when he was AG that a lot of good women were going untaken in the private sector, and he was smart to hire them in the AG's office. But I'd just be interested in your comments on that, Slade.
Well, you've made the comments. In fact, I became Attorney General at just about the time that large numbers of women were being graduated from law school. My own class at Columbia had 192 men and 4 women. And so the subject didn't arise then. But in the 1980s, we were coming up to equality, and now that we're more than equality between the two sexes. And downtown Seattle law firms mostly were not hiring women attorneys. And so even though the Attorney General's office pay was much lower than the private sector, we had the very tops in their class women available. And I don't know why I should deserve some credit for it. You'd be stupid not to take advantage of a situation like that. And I did with great happiness in the Attorney General's office, and then in the Senate office, where of course it was many of them were just being graduated from college, you know, I guess in a sense I'm sexist. I thought by and large women dealt with constituents better on the average than men did too. So it was a win-win situation in every respect.
And you got to live with 3 really bright women, that's for sure.
That's
you and
true.
Todd were well trained. Other questions? Yes, sir.
So I'm Joe Pinesco. I represent the Fish and Wildlife Division. Been with the AG's office for 18 years. Followed your footsteps. I graduated from Columbia in '95. In advising Fish and Wildlife, an interesting political topic that's getting a lot of bill coverage is Atlantic salmon. And a current trend is to try to say it's evil, it's destroying the environment, we should shut it down. Given your family business background, do you have any opinions on aquatic farming of Atlantic salmon?
Your brother's looking on, by the way, over there. So
I have a brother in the fish business here, but they buy fish where they're for sale. You know, they don't involve themselves and didn't, fortunately, and all of the fish issues I had was while I was in the United States Senate. But I guess overall my view on that subject is the world needs food, and we are continuing to increase populations at every place, and that we should not deliberately abandon a method of providing food for the people of the world arbitrarily. We can certainly be angry at a company which screws up as badly as Cook did, but that is not an indictment of the value of providing seafood in quantities that are sustainable and adequate for the world to eat.
Yes, Marianne?
Slade, you talked about your legacy being the young people that work for you in the Attorney General's office and your Senate staff. And a lot of people here might not know that Rich Ellings, who was on your staff, sitting next to Pat, who was on your staff, sitting next to Julie, who was on your staff, and many of us were here, have started the Slade Gorton International Policy Center at NPR across the street. One of the programs that we have is called the Global Leaders Program, which is an effort to extend that legacy to, I see two of them over there, Bruno Fiorentini and Quill Robinson are here. And I want people to know more about that so that as we start to recruit for next year, if they're interested, we take undergraduate, juniors, seniors, law school students, and graduate students who are interested in meeting with people like Rich and Chris Gregoire who work for you and you. So you forgot that, and as a good staffer, I'm telling you, you forgot that.
You did the job.
More questions? Here's your chance. Yes.
Yeah, I had the privilege of being part of your first congressional intern class when you were newly elected to the Senate on Oklahoma Highways. And I just want to ask you about what your goals were when you came into the Senate. Was that sort of surprising a Republican majority in the Senate? When I grew up, we were used to Democrats owning all of Congress, and I know you were part of this group of Republicans that took over the Senate in the 80s during the Reagan Revolution. What were your thoughts when you came back to Washington, D.C. that first time?
Oh, that's a good question. It take me back a considerable number of years. I did have, in an 18-year career in the United States Senate, I had, I think, every possible combination. A Republican president and a Republican Senate, a Democratic president and a Republican Senate and a Democratic president, and the House Democratic all the way until 1994. So I could see how each of them reacted to one another. And bluntly speaking, they did react much better in mixed situations, whatever the mix was, whether the president was a Republican or a Democrat, whether the House and Senate were Republicans and Democrats. And the problem today is that in order to get anything done, you have to have one party in charge, and you have to do more than that because of rules relating to filibusters in the Senate. And there is almost no crossover. There's a magazine in Washington, D.C. called National Journal that's probably the most objective analyst of the way in which members vote. And the Senate, the whole time that I was in the Senate, there was an overlap of 12 to 15 senators, maybe as many as 20, with a certain number of Republicans being more liberal than the most conservative Democrats and vice versa. In the last 4 or 5 years, that overlap has been zero. And it's for all practical purposes zero in the House. So there isn't that group of people in the center who first have a good deal of leverage, but second are talking to one another in a way that in a way that's constructive. And as I said earlier, we'd be a lot better off in the old disorderly system of much broader parties on both sides than we are in the situation which we're faced today.
We have 2 books to raffle off. Is that right, Lindsay? How's this work?
Wow.
It's like being at the Kiwanis Club. Here we go. Okay. Okay. What am I? Okay. Ta-da. Karen Jones.
Joe Panesco.
There you go. Fabulous. Thank you. Must be present to win. Okay. Senator, thank you so much. Happy birthday.
Thank you, John.